Welcome to Sleepy University. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now where you are? It's always comforting to know we're falling asleep, together, from different corners of the world, at different hours, but under the same sky. You wouldn't have lasted a day in medieval Europe, not because of the wars, not because of the hunger, but because of the smell, the air, the clothes, the bodies, all steeped in centuries of unwashed history. They didn't bathe, not the way we do, not even close. But why? Was it ignorance, a lack of water, or something far stranger? We live in an age obsessed with cleanliness, scented soaps, hot showers, hand sanitizer in every pocket. We wash our sheets, we scrub our skin. We believe that clean equals good. But in the Middle Ages, water was a danger, soap was a rarity, and bathing could be a sin. Close your eyes. You are walking through a medieval town. The streets are narrow, the air thick with smoke, dung, and sweat. The gutters overflow with waste. And above you, a cloth and skin hang from windows to dry, not because they've been washed, but because rain has fallen. You pass a knight in armor. You might think he smells of steel and leather, but in truth, he hasn't removed his underclothes in weeks. They cling to him, soaked with sweat, with dirt, with time, and no one notices. Because this is normal. You might wonder, why not just bathe? But water was feared. Physicians believed that when you bathed, your pores opened, and when they opened, illness could enter. The plague, the fevers. They didn't come from touch. They came from air, from spirits, from imbalance, and water. Water made you vulnerable. Some even believed that dirt was a barrier, that filth was a kind of armor, that by avoiding water, you avoided sickness. Tonight, we'll explore this strange world. We'll walk through ancient bathhouses, crawl into peasant huts, smell the perfumes of queens, and touch the robes of monks who never, ever washed. We'll learn what it meant to be clean, when clean was not about water. So rest easy, and let the dirt of the past lull you to sleep. When you imagine medieval Europe, what comes to mind? Stone castles, knights in shining armor, narrow alleys under Gothic arches, the sound of bells, the smell of roasted meat. But there's something you probably don't imagine, the smell. These towns, they smelled of leather and sweat, smoke and sewage, of bodies that hadn't touched water in months. And that was normal. Because in the Middle Ages, dirt wasn't just dirt. It was belief. It was protection. From illness, from sin, from temptation. So why didn't people bathe? First of all, because water was seen as dangerous, not because of germs, but because of open pores. Because wet skin was vulnerable. Because a cold draft after a bath could lead to death. And second, because the body itself was shameful. To undress was not just to reveal your skin, but to reveal your soul, especially for women, especially for the pious. Christianity had brought a new kind of morality, a new kind of anatomy, of guilt. Cleanliness was no longer beauty. It was exposure, a risk. But where was it clean? You may be surprised, but the cleanest places were often monasteries. There, water was used, not for the body, but for the spirit, to wash hands, to rinse feet in humility, to touch the face in silence, but never the whole body. And if someone did bathe, why? It wasn't for hygiene. It was for the soul. Washing became a ritual, a spiritual act, or a temptation. One 14th century woman confessed she felt ashamed of her desire for her husband, especially when they bathed together. The water, she said, awakened her flesh. What were the alternatives to water? Since water was dangerous, they cleaned themselves. Without it, herbal rubs, perfumes, musk, amber, frankincense. Vinegar baths, for the feet, not the body. Layers of cloth, soaked in flowers. And covering up, always covering up. The less the skin breathed, the safer you were. What did doctors say? Medieval medicine believed the body held 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and any disruption, especially from bathing, could disturb that sacred balance. Some physicians wrote, bathing weakens the body's natural heat and makes the soul vulnerable. Others recommended warm springs, but rarely and with many warnings. And then came the plague, the 14th century. The Black Death spread across Europe. Bathhouses closed. Water became feared. People stopped bathing entirely because the smell of your body was believed to protect you. If you smelled strong, you were safe. If you were clean, you were in danger. Dirt became an amulet, a shield. Picture this. You're walking through a medieval street. Stone roads, the scent of smoke, the scent of hay, the scent of horses, and the scent of people. Not one person, but everyone. The smell of the body was part of the crowd, part of the street, part of life. And no, it's not because they couldn't smell. They could, they did, but they sensed things differently. Today, we're used to the smell of shampoo, clean cotton, filtered air, but the medieval world smelled deeper, earthier, more alive. The scent of sweat wasn't shameful. It meant warmth. It meant presence. The smell of incense meant holiness. The scent of smoked meat meant celebration. But a strong, clean fragrance of laundry, that might seem suspicious. Bathhouses were real and popular. People did bathe, especially in the early Middle Ages, especially in cities, especially among the wealthy. Public bathhouses were more than places to wash. They were places to meet, to talk, to relax, sometimes even to flirt. In 13th century Germany, people would say, "I'm going to the bathhouse with my friend," and that didn't always mean bathing. Then, things changed. The church grew uneasy. Too much nudity, too much laughter, too much temptation. First, they banned men and women from bathing together. Then they tried to monitor who went and why. And then came the plague. People believed that bathing opened the pores, and through those pores, disease could enter. Doctors wrote, the cleaner the skin, the weaker the body. Water was no longer safe. Bathing became dangerous. Perfume replaced water. So what did people do instead? They used scent. The wealthy rubbed rose oil on their skin, carried satchels filled with herbs and spices, soaked cloth in vinegar and lavender. They wore layers of scented fabric, tied musk around their neck, powdered their faces. The poor, they did what they could, and no one was ashamed, because back then, smelling like a body wasn't disgusting. It was living. Imagine a knight, tall, armored, noble, glorious in song and story. But take off the poetry, and you'll find something else. A body wrapped in linen, a tunic worn for weeks, and under the armor, sweat, old sweat, mixed with dust, mixed with horsehair. Knights didn't bathe before battle. Sometimes, not even after. Gloves that never came off. Some nobles wore gloves for so long, their skin cracked beneath them. They slept in their clothes. They dined in their clothes. They prayed in their clothes. A knight might wear the same undertunic for days or weeks, sometimes a month. Why? Because undressing took time and vulnerability and help. and in a cold stone castle, warmth mattered more than freshness. What did sleep smell like? Beds weren't washed often, linen was rare, mattresses were stuffed with straw, sometimes shared, with servants, with fleas, with lice. Even queens had to comb for them, and still, no one panicked, because this was normal. This was life, and no one could smell themselves the way we do now. Cleanliness was moral, not medical. The church taught that dirt wasn't the enemy. Sin was. If your soul was clean, it didn't matter if your hands were not. Monks could go months without bathing, but they washed their hands before prayer because it wasn't about hygiene. It was about respect, about ritual. They weren't avoiding water. They were living with it carefully. In the Middle Ages, you could be born in a castle, wear a crown, dine from silver, and still smell like everyone else. Hygiene wasn't a matter of class, it was a matter of philosophy. And that philosophy was rather strange. Picture a royal bedroom, a grand canopy bed, furs, rugs, carved walls, and in the corner, something that looks like a velvet chair. That was the toilet. No flushing, no water, no ventilation. The smell, strong enough to force open the windows, even in winter. Kings and queens bathed rarely, but that doesn't mean they neglected themselves. Quite the opposite. The higher the status, the more elaborate the rituals. King Louis XIV of France feared water. He took a bath twice in his life, but he changed his linen daily. It was believed that clean fabric pulled dirt out of the skin. Queen Elizabeth I was proud of washing her face with rose water and vinegar. Her hair was brushed 100 times a day by her maids. It was said to purify the flows of bad blood. Perfumes, herbs, fabric. These were the true tools of cleanliness. The nobility wore little pouches of lavender and mint. They stuffed dried rose petals into their sleeves. They wore gloves soaked in vinegar. Scent was more important than actual cleanliness. There were fans, gloves, handkerchiefs. They covered the face when walking through the city. They waved away the stench. They pretended. Even kings could not escape the smell of the streets. In some castles, they built scent rooms, spaces filled with burning incense, hanging herbs, and bowls of fragrant water. These rooms were signs of luxury and thought to be good for health, but of course, none of it replaced water. Baths, they existed, but rarely, and when they happened, they were treated like theater. One chronicler described the bath of the Countess of Burgundy as a marvel of the world, a golden tub filled with warm wine, rose petals, and silk pillows. The Countess bathed alone, while servants carried trays of snacks and perfumes. But those were exceptions, symbols of power, not habits. Bathing was performance, not hygiene. Still, there were voices of change. A few court physicians began to speak in favor of mild washing. Some monks built small bathhouses in monasteries, saying, "A clean body is the vessel of a clean soul." But these were rare. Most likely, in medieval Europe, even the most elegant and refined people smelled. Cleanliness was still far away, but it was just beginning. When we think of medieval medicine, images come to mind. Plague doctors in beaked masks, bloodletting, prayers instead of cures. And the truth is, that's not far from reality. In the Middle Ages, illness was a mystery. No one knew what bacteria were. No one had heard of viruses. Even the word infection wouldn't exist for centuries. The human body was a secret. But the soul they understood. And so they believed, if someone got sick, it meant they had sinned. Health, they thought, was about balance. Not between proteins and vitamins, but between 4 fluids inside the body: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If one of them took over, sickness followed. So the treatment? Drain the blood, or use leeches, induce vomiting, cleanse the body with laxatives. Pain wasn't the enemy. It was a sign, a form of punishment, even purification. Suffering was holy. That's why many didn't try to get better. They endured. They prayed. Still, some tried to understand. Medieval doctors, strange, stubborn, almost mystical figures. They studied ancient books, written by Galen and Hippocrates 1,000 years before them. They looked to the stars, chose the right days for healing, measured pulses, and diagnosed by the color of urine. Doctors weren't for everyone. They were a luxury. The poor turned to herbalists, folk healers, old women who remembered the scent of leaves and the strength of the earth. Sometimes these women saved lives. Other times, they were burned as witches. But don't mistake it for ignorance. They simply didn't know, and they didn't have what we have. Still, they searched, they wondered, they asked questions. Why does the city stink of rot? Why does the stench bring sickness? Why does fresh air make us feel better? Many things they sensed. They didn't bathe, but they burned incense. They had no antibiotics, but they used herbs. They knew nothing of germs, but they kept their distance from the sick. And maybe one day, centuries from now, people will look back at us and say we were primitive too, that our medicine was crude, our tools barbaric. But this is how it goes, the long road of trial and error, from darkness to understanding. And while plague doctors roamed the filthy streets in dark robes and masks, in cellars and monasteries, in small villages and forgotten empires, people kept searching. They kept hoping that someday the world would be cleaner. And maybe so would the human soul. Imagine this: the rustle of fabric, heavy furs, velvet dragging across the floor, sharp scents of musk and incense. This isn't a ball, it's just a morning in a noble medieval household. Hygiene in the Middle Ages wasn't just about baths and soap. It was also about clothing. For many, it was more than protection from the cold or a way to look presentable. Clothing could prove purity, replace bathing, serve as armor against odor, illness, and even sin. Because the body was vulnerable, too alive, too sweaty, too human. The nobility wore layers upon layers, furs over thick wool, shirts beneath tunics, handkerchiefs, garters, gloves, cloaks. The more layers, the less chance anyone might glimpse skin or smell it. Outer garments were rarely washed. It was risky. Fabric could be ruined. Dyes could run. So instead, they changed the underlayers. The wealthy owned 4, 5, sometimes more sets of linen underwear, shirts and trousers. They were washed, but not often, and not in soap and water, but in lye or ashes, with herbs, even urine. The smell was distinct. Their bed linens were also cleaned, somewhat. Sheets and pillowcases were changed when possible, aired in the sun, beaten and shaken. But heavy blankets, fur throws, ornate bed covers, almost never washed. They were aired out, smoked with incense, freshened but not cleaned. And what about the poor? Most peasants owned just one outfit. They worked in it, slept in it, ate in it. It faded, darkened, absorbed everything, from smells to memories. There was often no underwear, just a rough woolen tunic or coarse linen. Shoes, if they had them, might be passed down from parent to child. And they slept, where they could, on straw, on bare boards by the fire, covered with an old cloak, or nothing at all. A bed was whatever wasn't cold, and dirt was simply part of life. Even the wealthy rarely washed their bodies. Instead, they disguised them. Aromatics were everything. Pouches of rosemary, sage, or mint hung from necks. Dried petals were tucked into shoes. Scented cloth was hidden in sleeves, and skin was rubbed with fragrant oils or infused with wine, vinegar, or salt. The stronger the scent, the cleaner you seemed, the more noble you appeared. But the word clean didn't mean what it does today. Cleanliness was a virtue, not a physical state, but a spiritual one. It meant modesty, self-restraint, covered skin, a pure soul, not a washed body. And dirt. Dirt was not always an enemy. It could protect. A layer of dust sealed the pores, preserved warmth, kept out disease, and perhaps the evil eye. Still, there were exceptions. Monks, with their ritual washings and cloths for face and hands. Women, who rubbed their skin with floral essences. Not for others, but for themselves. But mostly, the body remained hidden, in every sense, and if it was adorned, it was with fabric, furs, lace, gold thread, to smell like heaven, and look like an ideal, even if the flesh beneath had never once felt soap. Imagine a morning at the royal court. The stone halls are cold. The air smells of candles, damp walls, and rose water. Silence is broken only by the steps of servants carrying silver pitchers. Before you stands the king, a great ruler draped in furs, gold, and myths. But before he puts on his crown, a basin is brought to him, not for bathing, for ritual. Washing at court was a symbol, not of hygiene, but of power, of grace, of divine order. A servant would gently pour warm, scented water, often with rose petals. The king dipped his hands, sometimes his face. This was called ablutio, one of the few watery moments in his day. Sometimes even that was replaced with perfume, or cloth soaked in rose or lavender water, to dab the forehead, neck, and wrists, to leave a scent, not moisture. Real bathing was rare. A royal bath, if it happened, was a full ceremony. Water brought in buckets, heated in copper kettles. The room lined with herbs and flowers. The sound of water became a royal event, but the king himself might refuse. Especially in the later Middle Ages, bathing was seen as dangerous. Doctors warned, open pores are open doors for disease. A warmed body was vulnerable. Water could be healing, or a poison. In cold months, it was even riskier. Better to avoid it altogether. So instead of bathing, they rubbed. Royal skin was wiped with scented oils. Some areas were treated with vinegar, wine, or salt. Not for cleanliness, but for protection. Against sickness, against evil, against death. On special days, the body might be anointed with myrrh, musk, or amber. Scent became a second skin. Only the servants knew what lay beneath. Unwashed linen, rarely laundered bedding, and a living, sweating body. And the toilets, yes, castles had them, stone shafts built into the walls, some with seats, some leading into the moat, but they were feared, seen as places of filth, of bad spirits, of exposure, a place where something might slip in through you. So many kings preferred chamber pots. Servants carried them out or emptied them into the streets. Even royal waste ended up in the moat or on someone's head if you lived below. Bed linens. They were changed, but rarely. Too much washing damaged fabric. Mattresses, stuffed with straw or feathers, lasted for decades. They were layered with furs, wool, embroidered cloth. But washing them, that took water, fire, labor, women, time, so most linens were simply aired. And lice? Oh yes, everyone had them. Royal lice were not a myth. Even emperors owned special combs, kept in golden boxes. Gilded, decorated, sacred tools for scratching their royal heads. But if you smelled of amber, wore furs, and prayed 3 times a day, you were clean, even if your skin never knew soap. And the fear of water grew, especially among noble women. They were told, don't wash your face, it would age your skin. Don't wash your hair, it might awaken illness. Don't bathe your chest, you'll harm your fertility. And when they did bathe, it was a secret, with closed windows, a servant guarding the door, a physician nearby in case the body opened, and something entered. In the end, despite the gold, the perfumes, the silks, it was the rich who bathed the least, because they could afford not to, because they feared too much, because they had too much to lose. And so, the royal body remained hidden, wrapped in fabric, covered in wigs, guarded by scent, a legend more than flesh, but no less fragile than the poorest peasant's skin. Imagine a town before dawn, stone streets, buckets tipped from windows, a splash, a scream, a familiar warning, garde à l'eau, watch out below. This was morning in medieval Europe. There were no toilets as we know them. People relieved themselves in pots, corners, courtyards, and often they simply dumped it into rivers, onto streets, into moats. Some castles had toilet shafts, but they were feared for their smells, their dangers, even spirits. The scent of the Middle Ages wasn't hidden. It was everywhere. To mask it, people used herbs. Lavender in shoes, mint by the door, rosemary in clothes. But the smell always returned, and yet they lived with it, because to them, stench meant life. So next time you picture a medieval town, don't imagine shining knights and polished halls. Imagine ash on the floor, perfume on the wrists, and behind every stone wall, the quiet endurance of a world without plumbing. Because in the Middle Ages, clean didn't mean washed, it meant covered, perfumed, invisible. It meant still breathing. Imagine a town before dawn, stone streets, buckets tipped from windows, a splash, a scream, a familiar warning, garde à l'eau, watch out below. This was morning in medieval Europe. There were no toilets as we know them. People relieved themselves in pots, corners, courtyards, and often they simply dumped it into rivers, onto streets, into moats. Some castles had toilet shafts, but they were feared for their smells, their dangers, even spirits. The scent of the Middle Ages wasn't hidden. It was everywhere. To mask it, people used herbs, lavender in shoes, mint by the door, rosemary, clothes. But the smell always returned, and yet they lived with it, because to them, stench meant life. So next time you picture a medieval town, don't imagine shining knights and polished halls. Imagine ash on the floor, perfume on the wrists, and behind every stone wall, the quiet endurance of a world without plumbing. Because in the Middle Ages, clean didn't mean washed. It meant covered, perfumed, invisible. It meant still breathing. So now you know why no one bathed in the Middle Ages, why kings feared water, and why perfume replaced soap. Cleanliness once meant modesty, prayer, not warm water and soap. If you enjoyed this story, Sleepy University has many more. Soft-spoken lectures, whispers from the past to lull you into rest. Tell us where you're listening from. We'd love to know the time in your corner of the world. And now, close your eyes you're safe, you're warm. And tomorrow, as we'll meet again, good night from Sleepy University.